Good afternoon, Frank.
Good afternoon, Professor Spooner.
Globalization is progressing. Difficult to know where to start on what's been happening the past week, but I suppose the most unexpected thing was for the President of the Philippines to say that he was, I forget now what words he used, but
he said the United States has lost.
Yeah, after having told the President of the United States to go to hell, he just said that he was changing his country's foreign policy to ally mainly with China rather than with the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I think that that's a little strange in a way, because he's presumably giving up property in the South China Sea.
It seems as if he's completely abrogated any of their claims or concerns to just that. And the last thing I saw as well is that he expects to work with the Chinese on all of those issues. And they signed a $13.5 billion series of so-called trade pacts, and it was a real volte-face.
It's really not very likely that he and Xi Jinping could have made some sort of deal behind the scenes before he said it. I don't think the Chinese president is likely to say anything to Duterte that he might repeat.
No. Let me ask you a question. I recall from my study of South Asia that there's a very healthy and strong, financially strong community of so-called Xiao, overseas Chinese, in many Asian countries such as the Philippines, and I suspect also in Manila. And I suspect that if it follows true to form, these people have a lot of economic clout. Is there any sort of influence that could be perhaps being exercised by them?
Well, I've been wondering that. I mean, there's a big Chinese community in almost every country in Southeast Asia, both peninsula and insular, and they're very well. I've never actually lived with them. I've just wandered about in those countries, but it's always seemed to me that from what I've read, that they were all in favor of China. They don't feel themselves separated from China. And so I would think that the Chinese government could influence them quite easily.
And they, in turn, presumably have influence on the governments where they live, i.e., in this case, the Philippines.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was quite surprised by Duterte popping up in Beijing with those comments. And I wondered whether, I don't necessarily know what the rule of law is in the Philippines, or if he has to go through a Philippine Senate legislative process in order to formalize his about face, but it's going to be interesting to see it develop.
Well, we've not heard anything about a parliamentary process anyway.
Not a peep.
And it certainly suits the Chinese very nicely to have him do this.
Oh, yes. Let me ask you a question. I mean, the elephant in the room here is the no longer alleged but supposedly proven efforts by Russia to influence the American election.
I really don't know what to say about the American elections, except that the sort of thing that Gideon Rachman has been saying in the Financial Times, and other people as well, that it's a tragedy for global democracy, because America, even though the mother of all parliaments is in London, and that's not doing so well at the moment either. The building is falling down, and one of the main parties seems to be in really serious trouble. But even though Theresa May, the new Prime Minister, seems to be handling things in a very efficient and elegant and even if not charming way, but America is the country that's thought of as being the democratic leader of the world, and of course, one previous president, whom I won't name, decided that it was the main American export and we should push those exports and make sure that the whole world became democratic as soon as possible.
Mm-hmm.
This election process isn't going to do the idea of democracy very much good, I don't think.
No, I don't think it will. But in terms of globalization and I suppose the interactions and effects of regular rank and file people with peers in other countries, which is part and parcel to what globalization is. I mean, this is a pretty overt act by one government to try to influence the electoral process of another government, their primary rival. I mean, it's sort of unthinkable when you get right down to it. And I don't quite understand. I mean, I understand what Putin's goal is. The more disruption and disarray and confusion and chaos he can cause, the better. But at some point, there's going to be an accounting for this. I mean, I would think, especially if Mrs. Clinton wins. I think that,
well, relations are pretty bad at the moment. I mean, there's no threat of any outbreak of open hostility, but relations are pretty bad between Russia and the European Union and between Russia and the U.S., both in diplomatic terms and between the actual leaders.
mm-hmm.
And in fact, much worse than they have been for probably 20 years.
But I haven't seen anything like this since William the Conqueror tried to nose in on Edward the Confessor and that succession process back in 1066. I mean, this is about as overt as you can get.
Do we really know the details
of the 1066 census or the
no the current one?
Well, we do know that both
2016
that both President Obama and Vice President Biden have said that in fact 17 intelligence agencies within the U.S. government have confirmed that it is the Russians who are hacking the Democratic National Committee and the emails of the Clinton campaign and providing them to WikiLeaks.
Yeah, well, I'm just not sure to what extent they're actively trying to influence the election and to what extent they're actively supporting WikiLeaks
mm-hmm.
as a way of annoying the Americans.
Well,
because they know that the Americans are very annoyed, or at least the administration's very annoyed that
mm-hmm.
they've given asylum to
Snowden. Right. There's another question I want to ask you. I happened to be listening to NPR the other night, and they were going down the roster of the Allied army that is amassing in Mosul to try to retake the city from ISIS. And it's a who's who of everybody we've ever talked about. You have the Kurds, you have Shia militia, you have Sunni militia, you have the Iraqi army, and you have American advisors. And they're all on the same side. Isn't that a little unusual?
It's probably the most complicated situation of this type that we've seen so far. And the fact that Turkey is involved in it as well makes it even worse. Really, nobody has any idea at all how to solve the Syrian situation.
Mm-hmm.
Even if we could come to a deal with Russia and agree with Russia on what should happen, I don't think we know what to do.
Mm-hmm.
And Obama is getting a lot of criticism for doing nothing, but nobody suggests what he ought to do, except a few people, of course, who suggest he should put boots on the ground there, but that would just make things worse.
Much worse.
And certainly much worse for us.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that the best thing that could happen would be for Putin and us and the European Union and the Turks to get out.
Mm-hmm.
And let them work it out for themselves, because then at least they would know that whatever solution they come to was not been imposed on them.
Even if it meant the prospect of a near genocidal retribution by Assad?
Well, it's difficult to say, to answer a question like that, because what other genocides have we prevented? We didn't do very well in Africa, in Rwanda and Burundi, that's probably the only one we've actually tried. It's not easy to do anything.
No, and sooner or later you have to do the math. You have to look at the lives lost over the past 10 years and then figure out exactly how many that is compared to what would have happened if Assad had been given free rein and allowed to settle his own, put his own house in order, I suppose. So, yeah, I have one more observation to make. I mean, this American election, I know it's difficult sometimes to see the forest for the trees, but I guess because I'm here, and the overwhelming enormity of it in terms of coverage, and I mean, it's like having a 9,000-pound elephant in every room you're in 24 hours a day. And I've been reading articles in both the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal about the psychic effect on the American population that this election has had, both in terms of tone and length. And then I saw Prime Minister Renzi from Italy make a couple of comments at the White House the other day, squarely addressing the preoccupation that the Europeans have with the American election. And I mean, it's not a healthy dynamic. I mean, not only particularly this election, but the fact that every 4 years, the biggest democracy in the world comes to a full stop to go through this rigmarole.
Well, especially this time, since normally they talk about what they would do if they were president, instead of just having a slanging match between themselves. I was a little surprised that Obama talked as much about Trump as he did the other day.
Yeah, he's plainly all in, so to speak, on this, and it's a little breach of decorum, I would say. But nevertheless, I think some of the things that have been said by Trump so far have just incited him.
Well, especially because it's an insult to the American political process. I suppose that's his rationale for getting involved in it. But even so, he should have done it more explicitly in regard to the political process rather than the candidate himself, I think.
Well, let me ask you a question then. I mean, aside from the usual suspects, Beijing, Moscow, the European capitals, I mean, what would the view be in the Middle East as to what's going on in the United States right now with the election?
Iran wants Trump. I have not read anything or heard anything about the Saudis. But I think that much of the Middle East would be happy to see America in trouble.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that. Even though into that vacuum would rush Russia.
Yeah, and China. China is already active in some parts of the Middle East.
Very much so. Definitely, it's a very peculiar dynamic right now. And to be honest with you, and we've been talking off and on for a couple of years, who would have predicted even 8 months ago that we'd be having this kind of a discussion?
Well, I think, I mean, I've been watching American elections since, was there an election in 1968? I can't remember.
Yes, there was. Lyndon Johnson and Nixon against Humphrey.
Well, that's right. That's the first one that I watched, and the debates and so on. And there's never been a primary season or a campaign like this. They've all had reasonably well qualified candidates who were talking about what they would do as president. Is a puzzle to me, and I really don't understand it, and I wish somebody would explain it, because I've not seen anybody really address this, is why the Republican Party couldn't come up with serious candidates for the primary season. And some people said, well, you know, they had Cruz, they had Kasich, and they had other people, but these were not. I mean, Cruz didn't have the support of the party. Kasich didn't come in until late and left very easily.
I think what you're putting your finger on is something that the rank and file Republicans are so heartsick about that it's not even funny. Because I think there's a recognition that if they did have a different candidate, given the weaknesses of the Democratic candidate, they would have a pretty darn good chance to win. And
there was yesterday I saw a photograph of 6 living past U.S. presidents, 2 Bushes, Clinton,
Jimmy Carter.
Bushes, Clinton, Carter. I think there were 2 others. Who would they have been?
I think it depends when you saw the picture. It could have been when Gerald Ford was alive.
No, I think no, it was recent. I think, and with a statement that none of them will vote for Trump.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
it's an interesting time. Well, these are the perils that we face in the 21st century with instant communication and Twitter and globalization and Snapchat and WhatsApp.
Well, as I think I may have said before on one of our previous discussions, I think that democracy worked very well when people did what they were told.
Mm-hmm.
But now everybody thinks they have a voice,
mm-hmm.
and so the people who don't know have as much influence on what happens as the people who know. And that's very dangerous for the democratic process globally.
We can only hope that there are more people who do know than who don't know. So, but I guess we'll find out. We'll find out in 18 days.
I better go and teach my class.
All right, Brian. Thank you very much for your time. All right.
And you. Bye.
Bye.